All right, it's 6:01. We'll go ahead and get rolling on the conversation. First of all, thank you all very much for attending our webinar Q&A tonight, discussing the Yorba Linda resident-driven housing element. My name is Ryder Todd Smith. I consult with the city on the community outreach component of this effort to make sure we are casting the net far and wide to seek active community feedback on this very important issue, something that I know for certain is near and dear to the residents of Yorba Linda. My role tonight is to MC this call, field questions, and really tee the questions up to give them to Nate and David so we can move through them efficiently and try to get out as much information as possible this evening to help the public know what is up and what's going on. So that's the mission for tonight. I want to just note a couple of things. First, we're going to go through some quick panelist introductions. We have a presentation that I'm hoping is going to take 20 to 25 minutes. For those of you that saw a presentation at the city council meeting when they received the working group's report, it's going to be some similar content, but our goal is to baseline everybody with a similar knowledge about what's going on with the housing element. And then we'll jump into Q&A. We are scheduled to go till 8 o'clock tonight, and then we're going to have to bring it to a close because some of our panelists need to get off to some other appointments they have this evening. I also just want to note this is being recorded, and that's really on purpose. This is a great studio setup for us, and our goal is to get this recorded so it becomes an educational asset as part of our strategic outreach strategy to make sure we're getting everybody out there in the community. So we'll get this recorded tonight. It'll be up on yllocalcontrol.com. You'll see that URL throughout the slide deck this evening. This is a new dedicated website the city has launched related to the housing element process and ensuring access to lots of information to aid the community understanding the housing element process. So real quick, let me have my two panelists introduce themselves. David, you want to quickly just tell us who you are, what you do at the city, how long you've been doing planning work?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Brantley. I am the city's Community Development Director, and I've been working for the city actually twice since I started in 1996, left for a couple of years in 2000 timeframe, came back and have been here since. Been working with Nate on the housing element this particular cycle for the last couple of years since 2020, 2021 timeframe.
Great. And then Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nate Farnsworth. I'm the city's planning manager. I've been the key project manager related to the housing element. I've been working in the city since 2016. Prior to that, I've spent most of my planning career in Orange County. This is my third housing element cycle that I've been through as a lead project manager in going through the housing element process. So that's who I am.
Awesome. Well, your nickname became Nate the Great throughout our process so far, so I'll try to resist using that too often. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, first, another reminder that we are going to be recording tonight. And like I said, we're going to get to Q&A a little bit later. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions. I already see one's been submitted. It says Q&A on it. That's how you can submit your questions to us tonight, and we'll be trying to get through those. I also just want to remind everybody, and I'll say this a little bit later in the evening too, we had it open for the last several days to be able to submit questions. So we actually have a bunch of pre-submitted questions that are already in the pipeline for us. And so we're going to get started with some of those this evening as well. So I want to thank a bunch of members of the community who pre-submitted some questions. So this slide is an important one because I really feel like when we have community conversations, and so much in our society these days, we struggle to make sure we all agree upon some facts in conversation. So what I want to just make sure is we all get agreement on certain facts that are really, frankly, were facts that our working group that we assembled, and you hear more about them in a bit. But these were facts that we were all operating under as we put together the housing element plan that the residents devised in this working group, and we're now presenting as a draft concept and coming to you, the fellow residents of Yorba Linda, to discuss. So number one, basic fact that the RHNA housing allocation, that stands for Resident Housing Needs Assessment process, and we can get into the nerdy details about that, basically says the city has to plan for 2,415 housing units, and then what's called the sixth cycle, or units to be developed between the year 2021 and 2029. There's a whole labyrinth of process of how that gets allocated, and we have a couple questions that came on that, so we'll get into details about that a bit later. Second fact is that cities that don't have a certified housing element can face very negative impacts, such as loss of state funding, loss of local control, and risk of builders' remedy claims as well. And so really getting a certified housing element is a big defense against all those issues. And those are real issues. Those are real concerns. Number three, that while in 2022, the city voted, had a chance to vote on this and decided to vote no on the housing element as presented then, 2024 represents the last opportunity to actually adopt a certified housing element and then implement that zoning through your voter choice measure there, measure B. And that if we fail to do that, we will actually lose what is currently our conditionally certified housing element. And then once we lose that, then the barn doors open and a bunch of other negative consequences can manifest. Fourth item is that generally the legal pathways toward battling against housing laws, state mandates, and the RHNA housing allocation are all highly likely to fail or are challenged. So far, we've seen some rebuff on lawsuits the city's been involved with. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And it seems pretty clear from most policy experts we speak to that there's not a white knight coming in to rescue us on these issues before November of 2024. So it's kind of 2024 or bust in terms of adopting a housing element. And then last but not least, to that point, that the citizen statewide ballot measure to restore local control are currently long shots. And it's not even clear if adopted that they would actually address, indeed probably would not address, the RHNA housing allocation for the city. So kind of these facts all were discussed extensively with our working group residents, and we've discussed it with legal counsel. And these are the operating facts that we have tonight. We'll be presenting these same facts in our workshops when we go about across town to visit with folks, and happy to have conversations about those as well. But these are operating facts that we're trying to move forward with so we can make good choices and help empower you with good decision-making framework for options. All right, we'll go to the next slide. And with that, I want to hand it off to David because I want him to take a few moments to explain housing elements and then move through some other items. David?
Oh, thank you, Ryder. So what is this thing called the housing element anyways? What does it do? Who requires it? It's part of city's general plan. State law requires all cities to have a general plan. It consists of what are called 7 elements. One of those elements is the housing element, and it's basically a housing plan that is required to meet the state's housing mandate. Every 8 years, the state issues essentially a quota to all communities in the state of California, requiring them to produce or provide the capacity to produce, more specifically, a certain number of housing units. The state agency that administers housing mandates on behalf of the legislature is the Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD. How many units does Yorba Linda has Yorba Linda? How many cycles has Yorba Linda adopted? Well, housing element law came into effect in the 60s. So there's been 6, we're in the 6th cycle right now. And so my guess is that Yorba Linda has been involved in probably 5 of the 6 cycles that have occurred to date thus far. What is different about this cycle compared to last cycles? Well, I've worked on a couple of cycles here in Yorba Linda, the 4th and the 5th cycle. And the 4th and 5th cycles were much lower levels of units. I think we had around maybe 1,800 units in the 4th cycle. And then in the 5th cycle, we had 669 units. How did we get our housing unit allocation?
And so I guess just to your point, so 669 last cycle roughly, and now we're at 2,415 in this cycle. So it's
correct.
Been a 4x
so
increase.
Huge difference, and Yorba Linda is not unique. in terms of the difference between the RHNA number that we're working with this cycle versus prior cycles across the county and across the entire Southern California, what's known as the SCAG region. The story is pretty much the same, and it really derives from the fact that the state issued to the SCAG region a very high, what's called the regional RHNA number, which was 1.34 million units for the sixth cycle. So how did we get our housing unit allocation? Well, HCD issues the regional RHNA number, which is again the 1.34 million housing units, and then our regional planning entity called the Southern California Association of Governments, which is a metropolitan planning agency. They are charged with the responsibility for determining how that 1.34 million units is allocated to the individual jurisdictions within the SCAG region. So, and they come up with a formula that's very complex, and I think Nate's going to touch a little bit on that later in the presentation. And essentially, you know, the RHNA process is intended to provide housing capacity to meet what the state has determined as the number of units that are necessary to further the state's interest in providing housing of all income levels. And it's not the only type of housing that is built in cities. In fact, the RHNA number itself is composed of actually 4 different levels of housing: low and very low income level, then moderate income level, and then finally above moderate, or what is also called market rate housing. So apart from the RHNA, there's other housing that gets built in communities by private developers, which is, again, is market rate housing. Next slide. So I think, Ryder, you touched on the fact that, you know, some of the ideas that have been kind of floating around housing policy the last year or so is this idea of maybe fighting the state and pushing back against these housing mandates. And the city certainly is involved in pushing back to the extent that we're able to. And we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of that. But the idea of just sitting on our hands and doing nothing while some of these other efforts play out is very risky. So what our approach has been, and what the city council's thought has been on this, is to work in parallel with some of these efforts to challenge some of these housing mandates, but also plan for the worst. And so we're doing both. We are, you know, working towards complying with the law, while at the same time participating in some of these legal challenge efforts and other efforts to try to affect changes in the current housing policy situation in the state. Next slide. So after the failure of Measure Z, which was the ballot measure last election in November of 2022, it became pretty clear that the city needed to do more outreach and connect in a better way with our residents as it relates to trying to figure out a path to possibly creating a new housing element or making revisions to the prior housing element effort that would be more palatable to the community and hopefully could help us retain our conditional certification. So Last June, we invited a group of residents from across the city to join us in a conversation about housing policy in the city. It was made up of 17 residents who had previously plugged into the whole housing issue and were interested in it and had ongoing interest in wanting to try to help create a better plan. So again, those were selected from, across the city so that all geographic areas of the city were represented.
Yeah, and I think to that point, David, we actually have a map. If you want to go to the next slide, we can go ahead and move to the next slide too.
So actually, here's the folks that participated in our working group, and the map shows where their home is. As you can see, it's pretty diversely dispersed across the entirety of the city, so that all interests were represented. Go back to the previous slide.
Actually, we can keep moving forward, David. I want to make sure we keep moving. So,
okay.
But fundamentally, that's just a roster of all the content for the report, which is available on yllocalcontrol.com.
Got it. Okay, next slide then. So why pursue a certified housing element? So certification, as Ryder mentioned, provides a defense against a lot of things that can happen to cities that fall out of compliance. These include fines against the city, which can amount to as much as $600,000 a month, which is a significant number, $7.2 million per year. Just for context, that's enough money to fund, I think we said 23 sheriff's deputies. Yeah. It's a huge number. You also can lose local control. The state can take over your permitting process, and they can dictate where housing is going to go. And one of the concerns is that the first place they're going to look probably isn't going to be far from the sites that have already been identified. I mean, Yorba Linda is almost a built-out community. There are not a ton of sites, so the thought is that a lot of the same sites that had already been considered by the community in the previous and current housing element efforts would likely become sites if we were to lose local control. Builder's remedy, that is a law that is part of sort of this morass of housing laws in California. And what it basically says is that for cities that do not have a certified housing element, a builder can come into the community and basically dictate to the community where and what they want to build, irrespective of the zoning or general plan land use designations of the property, as long as they provide at least 20% of the units within their project as affordable to lower income persons, or 100% of the units affordable to moderate income persons. And we're going to talk a little bit about those income levels later on as well. And then other potential things that can happen, you can lose state grant money, which pay for our roadways, our contribution to homeless sheltering services in Placentia and in Buena Park and Anaheim. We're part of a coalition of North Orange County cities that basically provides a lot of services for homeless people. It allows us to enforce our anti-vagrancy laws in the city and anti-camping within public rights of way laws. So a lot of sanctions that can occur. There also are lawsuits that can be filed by housing advocacy groups. There are numerous yes in my backyard type groups in the state that their mission is to ensure that housing is available for all Californians in each community. So next slide, please. So again, the lead up to the working group I mentioned a moment ago, really it was Measure Z failed by 75%. I think the community spoke loud and clear that they were not happy with the city's initial stab at a housing element. And again, we needed to involve residents directly in coming up with a housing element 2.0 that hopefully would be more palatable to the community and would address the concerns that were evident in the previous go around. Next slide. So after working with the working group, we did achieve consensus. I won't say that it was, with a lot of alacrity or celebration. I think it was really tough. Not honestly, most people in Yorba Linda really love the community the way that it is, and they don't necessarily embrace the idea of expanding housing production in the city. However, in light of all of the issues that we're discussing this evening, they understand that it's state law and that the sort of lesser of evils is to try to maintain a certified housing element to insulate the city from a lot of the sanctions that I mentioned earlier. So no one was super excited about it though. But it was something that they felt was a better plan and addressed a number of the concerns and balanced out the number of units across the geography of the city in order to really address one of the major concerns that we heard, which was there were more units that were on the west side of town in the original plan. Next slide. So the working group also came up with some guiding principles for where to put housing in general, and the idea of really protecting our single family neighborhoods was very much one of the planning principles that they encouraged. They also encouraged preservation of open space and greenfield development over infill. They also wanted the city to be very mindful of fire hazard severity zones. A lot of these are on the city's east side of town and north boundary, as you know, where urbanized area meets the wildland. At these margins, that's where we've had serious wildfires over the years, and making sure that we are very mindful of developing new housing within those areas and ensuring that we have considered evacuation routes and ability to evacuate, as well as other issues that can help mitigate the hazard from fire. Again, wherever reasonably possible, zoning should avoid putting high density next to single family. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some of the ideas for revising the plan later on. Next slide. Just a couple more of the planning principles. The idea of reducing building heights when adjacent to single family, having greater setbacks, ensuring that we have design standards that will foster high quality appearance with our architectural design, that we try to use or create mixed use areas wherever it's economically appropriate. And the idea of doing that in Savi Ranch came through really very prominently. Mixed use is often an idea that can be employed in areas that are somewhat declining, commercial areas that are declining. if you can introduce housing, it provides kind of a natural customer base for retail. So that idea was supported by the working group. And then the idea of ensuring that our parks and trail systems and recreation and open space areas are preserved, and that we try to expand those as they occur in our general plan and apply them wherever possible. Next slide.
So David, I'll take it from here.
Okay.
So the working group came up with basically 6 key suggestions for the city council and for the community even to consider. You can see them here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but the key ones is that the working group did recommend that retaining local control through a 2024 ballot measure is far more important than losing local control through some of these penalties that the state has in place. And recommendation that the city needs to utilize more tools to inform residents and provide them with information to understand the issues here. The working group also recommended that the city conduct a scientific survey to better understand public sentiment, and the city is working with a firm, FM3, to assist in this effort. And then finally, David, mentioned the importance of mixed use concepts, and the working group did recommend that, and especially recommended focusing on the Savi Ranch area as a potential new downtown-like area for Yorba Linda. Let's go to the next slide. So where we started, basically we took the plan that was approved by the city council in 2022, the one that appeared before the voters, which was conditionally certified by the state. And we worked from that plan. The council had removed 4 sites from the housing element prior to Measure Z. And the working group took that housing element and worked with that to come up with what we're essentially calling Housing Element 2.0. Let's go to the next slide. I'd like to walk through some of the specific changes that are here. This slide here just summarizes the working group's recommendations. I'm going to use the maps that are on the next couple slides to walk through a visual representation of exactly what changes are proposed. But essentially it consisted of removing certain sites, reducing the proposed density on certain sites, and adding some sites that seem to be more of interest to the public. So let's go to the next one and I'll talk through that. So the model plan here, this is going to be broken up into 3 different sections of the city that you'll see. So let's start with the first one on the next slide, which is, these are the east side changes that were proposed. You can see from the map here, this site right here, the city council, this is the site at Meadowland, Camino de Bryant. Council did recommend removing that. The working group said, let's keep that off as well. Everything else, the other changes that are proposed here was the recommendation to add a new 8-acre site in Savi Ranch that would allow for densities up to 60 units to the acre. And also a recommendation to reduce the density at the Bryant Ranch Center from 35 units to 10 units to the acre. And that 10 unit to the acre zoning, I should point out, is limited in 2 stories in height. So this resulted in a 70% reduction on the Bryant Ranch Center site, which was one of the real contentious areas that was raised during the public outreach process during the last Measure Z process. This does result in a significant increase in the Savi Ranch area, but we did hear from a number of working group members, as well as during the public hearing process, that there was an interest in utilizing Savi Ranch to help solve this housing situation that we've got. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about the central changes that were proposed. Again, there are 3 sites, although they appear as more like 2 sites on here, that the council removed, and the working group recommended keeping those off as well. This is
to
a
be
site.
clear, Dave, Nate, excuse me, when you're talking about sites removed, are you referring to the little red outline areas?
Yeah, so the red outlined areas are sites that have been recommended for removal, to not be included, that had at one point been included as a recommended site. So the working group has recommended removing these red sites. So this is at the southern terminus of Ohio. I know we don't have street names on here. This is a small parcel at the intersection of Kellogg and Grandview. That site was recommended to be pulled out. And then within the central area as well, the Chabad Center off of Yorba Linda Boulevard, that had been identified as a congregational land site. And that was recommended for removal as well. One of the big key areas that I would like to point out, the Fairmont site, which is a vacant parcel, 23-acre parcel up off of Fairmont. There was a recommendation to reduce the acreage, the developable acreage of that site from 23 acres down to 3 acres, which is a reduction of 230 units to 30 units. I know that was a hotbed site, no pun intended. That resulted in a reduction of 85% of the units that were proposed for the Fairmont site. That site at the 10 unit to the acre density would also only allow for 2-story units to be built there. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about the changes proposed on the west side. West side definitely had the larger number of sites that were proposed originally, and that was one of the concerns of the working group was, digging into a little bit of a fairness factor. And you can see the red sites that are proposed on here, especially as you look kind of down that Eureka corridor. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sites that were proposed by the working group to be removed. You can see those sites listed on the slide here, but specifically the big concerned area in this on the west side was the high density of 35 units to the acre proposed at the Christmas Tree Farm down south of Richfield Community Church. The working group was recommending here a reduction on that site of about 70% of the units that were proposed there. So instead of being 35 units to the acre, that site would change to a 10 unit to the acre site, which again is limited to 2 stories in height. And so that's a 70% reduction for that site. And overall on the west side, with all of those changes, you're looking at about a 35% reduction of what was previously proposed on the west side to what the working group is recommending here. So let's jump to the next slide. And I think that wraps up my portion. Oh, this is just a table that sort of illustrates when you look at the west side versus the central versus the east side of the city. You can see when we total everything up, there's about an equal balance on the west side versus the east side, and certainly the central portion has some units that are proposed there, but that was one of the big concerns with the working group, was having sort of a balance between the west side of the city and the east side of the city. And so let's jump to the next slide. And that wraps up my portion. I think I'm tossing this over to you, Ryder.
I think you are, Nate. Thank you. Actually, go back one slide real quick. I just want to make a quick point. Some eagle-eyed observers may be wondering how the numbers at the bottom of the slide do not sum up to 2,415 units we keep talking about. And the answer is this is only demonstrating the net change in zoning allocation to try to get to units on east, west versus central. There's additional units that are being accounted for in the overall plan, such as accessory dwelling units, ADUs, that are also being counted towards that net 2415 number. And all these details, to be clear, are outlined in the report document that was produced that's available at yllocalcontrol.com. And I know we just threw a ton of numbers at you all. So the other thing to know is literally as we talk right now, if you go to yllocalcontrol.com and then on the top menu bar, you click on community engagement workshops. In the workshops that are listed there, this PowerPoint deck is ready for you to download in PDF format, and you can review it to your heart's content and even preview the slides you're going to be seeing, although at this point, there's only a couple left. I've also already seen a couple questions stream in asking about recording for this. Yes, this is being recorded. Yes, it will be posted to that exact same webpage I just referenced, and it should be available probably by tomorrow to be up on the website. And we urge you to share it with people in your neighborhood and the community in general, so that everybody gets a chance to start gathering up some of this important information. So we will be making everything available and want people to know what's up, particularly as we head into our 3 in-person workshops we have later. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So to that point, this is only the beginning of public engagement. It's not the end. We have a long road ahead of us before we finally submit theoretically in November with this plan. So all of the effort we're doing right now is all geared around fulfilling the objectives and ideas of the city council and the working group that we need to rigorously engage the community on this program, give you, the members of the public, an opportunity to hear all the complex issues and understand the nuances of housing policy in California, so that you fully have all the details to make some thoughtful decisions. Because ultimately, the outcome of all this, should it move forward to a ballot measure, meaning yes, we advance a housing element, and yes, the city council seeks to implement it, and there will be zoning changes, it will be subject to Measure B, and it will receive. It would be subject to the vote of you, the community members of Yorba Linda. Next slide. So as I noted, there are 4 phases, and I say they're potential because it's not a fait accompli about what happens at phase 4 or phase 3 for that matter. Right now, we're sitting in phase 2. Phase 1 was our working group that we gathered up. Phase 2 is the feedback the information we're providing tonight, the 3 upcoming workshops and coffee sessions, and the website we have, and the emails you can submit to us with ideas and feedback on the plan. That is all happening now and will be happening through October. And then come November through July, we'll be advancing the housing element, hopefully to a vote through the commission and ultimately direction from the city council to submit the plan to HCD. So the Housing and Community Development Department up in Sacramento can review the plan and make a determination that it is compliant with their guidelines, and it can be certified. In this case, it'll again be conditionally certified because it will require a vote of the residents. And then assuming that that comes back and is conditionally certified and ready to move forward, and we don't have to go through an iteration, although we may have to make some amendments to it, depending upon what HCD says, we'll then move to what we kind of call the phase 4, which is council gives direction, and we know we have to implement zoning changes, and those zoning changes are going to require ballot measure. So between July of 2024 and November of 2024, there'll be additional information made available to the public to ensure voters are fully informed about the choice they get to make. And this will be then present on a ballot in November of 2024, which will be the last opportunity the public will have to vote on this matter before we would, for all intents and purposes, lose our certification of the housing element. All right, next slide. So here's just the rough general timeline that we have going on. I just kind of covered this in detail, so I'm not going to regurgitate this too much because I want to move on to these excellent questions I see streaming in. So we'll go to the next slide. A reminder that at the bottom of your screen, you should see this little Q&A button. If you click that, you can submit questions. And I know some of you are successfully submitting now, so that's phenomenal. We'll be taking your questions and starting to answer those. Just keep in mind, again, we had a number of questions get submitted ahead of time. So we have a bunch of questions that we already need to work through. So if we don't quite get to yours quickly, that's not because we don't care about it. It just means because we're trying to be responsive to some of the questions that were pre-submitted, A. B, it is entirely possible that we'll talk for 2 hours tonight and we won't get to every question. We will be documenting every question you submit, and we will attempt to get back to you, if through nothing else than the frequently asked questions on the website. If we feel like your question is very similar to other questions that have been asked, we'll just kind of package it all together in one single answer so we can be efficient with our Q&A time tonight, or we'll package it in with other questions that we're addressing on the YL local control website as well. So you may not hear your question verbatim, but we are attempting to get to every one of them. Okay, I think with that, we're going to leave this. You can actually take down the PowerPoint for now, please, for my Zoom engineer. And just now you can get the full glory of my face much larger, and David and Nate's as well. And we're going to jump into some of our questions that we have here. So first question, and actually I saw this in a comment too on social media, and David, I'm going to throw you this question. So why doesn't the city just ignore the state and agree to pay fines? Because we talk about $600,000 in fines for not having a certified housing element.
Well, that's a great question, Ryder. I wish it were that easy. You know, the paying the fines is not an alternative to having a certified housing element in the eyes of the state, however, and it's not really like an opt-out provision. And so
fundamentally, we could pay the fines, and then we'd still be at risk of builder's remedy. We'd still lose access to grant funds. We'd still have all the other negative consequences in addition to paying $600,000 a month in fines to the state.
Correct. And the $600,000, as we mentioned a moment ago, is not an insignificant amount of money. Those are real dollars that the city, frankly, would rather spend on other things that kind of register a little higher on the community satisfaction meter.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I think ultimately, as you said, there's no way to just pay your way out of the situation. Nate, will our neighborhood voices or other theoretical ballot measures alleviate the need to have a housing element?
Yeah, again, great. We got great questions here, but responding to this one, so this is a big what if scenario, and while it's sort of a fun theoretical exercise, really until there's something that's qualified for the ballot, it's really hard to deal with reality and what if scenarios. So we're definitely monitoring what's going on with the constitutional amendments that have been considered or thrown out there. And we will certainly pivot as necessary through that process. And the other thing I would just point out is that currently as drafted, the constitutional amendment from our neighborhood voices, for example, it really doesn't even have a clear provision that would overturn or revise the RHNA for this housing cycle. It really, as written, the way that we understand it, is geared more towards addressing some of the other state housing laws that have been adopted since 2016. As David mentioned, RHNA's been around since the 60s, and it's really, really unclear whether this would have any effect on the RHNA for this cycle.
Yeah. So I think we're keeping an eye on that, but I would also just say we brought in a few political experts to come comment, and they weren't inherently intentionally negative on our neighborhood voices, but I think they were also providing some realistic tea leaf reading, which is that the legislature in Sacramento is only interested in more state housing mandates. So that's not going to get any changes on the law anytime soon. And number two, that until there's some good, there's been no clear financial method to actually pay for our neighborhood voices with big money showing up, as most initiatives require these days. So it was viewed as a long shot, I think, from their sense of things. Obviously, this is politics. Everybody can have an opinion. Next question. So a question from Russ H. If the Yorba Linda rezone plan should fail in November 2024, what are the next steps and kind of timelines that would happen from that?
So Ryder, let me take that one. I would say that more than likely the first step that the state would take is that they're just going to simply decertify our housing element. By not having a certified housing element, it's a simple way for the state to open the city up to potential lawsuits from third parties, and also to builders remedy. I could see the state taking further action if necessary, but my guess is that that would be the first step that the state would take.
Yeah. Okay. Nate, just to stick with you, I guess, because you're the man with the plan when it comes to some of these specifics here. But so how real is the builder's remedy threat from your perspective? And what has our legal counsel said, frankly, that you can share?
So again, just a reminder that builder's remedy essentially is that if you don't have a certified housing element, it doesn't matter what your zoning or general plan says. A developer can come in and submit an application as long as it meets certain state mandated provisions for providing a certain level of affordable housing. They can submit that to your city, even if it doesn't comply with your local regulations. We're seeing these builders remedy projects being submitted all across the state. Santa Monica has probably been one of the biggest ones in the headlines, where they're seeing even single family homes that are being purchased up. So a single family lot purchased with an application submitted for a multi-story housing complex. Beverly Hills, I just read an article in the newspaper today about Beverly Hills being submitted with a builder's remedy claim. More local to Orange County, the city of Orange has several builder's remedy applications that have been submitted there. And you may have read about La Habra, that's got their golf course project that they've been in a lawsuit with Lennar Homes over developing that area. The courts recently sided with La Habra on the denial on the application that was submitted by Lennar, but as a backup, Lennar has a builder's remedy application that's separate and apart from what the courts sided with the city on, and they're using that as their backup plan for moving forward with development on that site at an even higher density than what they were originally proposing to the city. The other thing I would point out is that what we're seeing is that a lot of cases with builders remedy projects, again, the question has come up, have we seen the courts play out on these builders remedy projects? We really haven't at this point. It's new enough that we haven't seen that play out through the courts. But what we are seeing is these significant applications that are submitted, and then the developers are using that as leverage with the cities to negotiate down to something that the city's willing to accept. That's still not something that they want, but it's better than what was originally proposed. So when we ask, is this a real threat? Absolutely, this is a real threat.
Well, and I would say it had been up until this year, not particularly well tested in the courts, but this is part of the changing environment that's going on right now.
Yeah.
And so we are seeing it weave its way through courts. There are lawsuits that are starting to come out, and some decisions, they haven't been finalized. There's trials that are being, or there are trials happening, or there are settlements taking place just to avoid the final answer. So, but everything that's playing out so far has most cities running for the hills on the remedy issue. And mostly they're arguing about when they actually achieved their certification or were substantially in compliance with the law to avoid the builder's remedy application in the first place, and what I've seen. All right, and Nate, I'm sticking with you. So the alternative to the prior question that Russ H had asked, which is, so previously he asked, what happens if it fails in November 2024? So what happens if the rezone, whatever ballot measure happens in November of 2024 succeeds? What's the timeline there?
Yeah, that's another great question. And what I would say is that the question that would be on the ballot in November 24 essentially is, does the public support rezoning the properties that are outlined in the plan? So if whatever measure letter is assigned in November 24, if that is approved, then that puts the zoning in place to allow for the property owner to move forward if they want with redevelopment of their property as outlined within the parameters that are established within the zoning code. So that essentially gives the green light for the rezone to be put in place.
But it's entirely, again, as always, and just to be clear about this, the city zones, but developers develop, right? Or
Correct.
private people develop. It's not, the city is not out there with a hammer and a nail and a 2x4 putting up buildings.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any outlook on the schedule for starting to prepare for the next housing element? Because the reality is this is the 6th. There's going to be a 7th, unless maybe some drastic law change. What does that look like?
Yeah. So as I think David mentioned earlier on, these housing elements, they run for an 8-year cycle. So this current cycle, the 6th cycle, goes from 2021 through 2029. The next cycle will run from 2029 through 2037. So the planning stages for the 7th cycle, they should start preparation. It all starts with the preparation of what's called the 2028 Regional Transportation Plan, and that feeds into the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So beginning around probably fall of 2026, the SCAG level will start discussing the Regional Transportation Plan and the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And I would just like the public to know that just like the last cycle, we will be closely monitoring the SCAG discussions that are related to the 7th cycle RHNA, and we will be participating to make sure that our voice is heard.
And, this, I guess, the one thing that's been kind of clear in David's comments earlier about the 4x increase in unit allocation for this cycle is that this is a different kind of RHNA housing cycle. And Yorba Linda is not alone in that experience, right? You were one of many cities that have experienced that. Why was this one different, or what's different than prior?
So Jerry Brown, when he was governor, passed a number of different housing bills that very aggressively pursued the ability to increase housing production through the state. So state law several years ago for this 6th cycle RHNA introduced several new demographic and housing factors for the 6th cycle, and those weren't included in previous housing cycles. So for example, the state required that the RHNA not only include a projected housing need for future housing growth, but also the need for what they called existing housing need. And they tied that back to situations where people are living in overcrowded conditions or they're in cost-burdened households. That was considered existing housing need for those that are currently here, not for those that will need housing later. So that was one big change. Also, in this cycle, HCD was given a lot more discretion over the allocation of housing units per region. So, and each region is responsible to allocate down to each subregion or each jurisdiction. So SCAG fought the number that was issued by HCD. That's our region, the Southern California region. SCAG had to allocate the plan based off of this number that was assigned by the state, and that put a lot of units in Yorba Linda. And this regional housing need of 1.34 million housing units, that's the basis of what OCCOG has been, or the Orange County Council of Governments has been arguing in their lawsuit against the state. They argued that the state did not follow the law when they calculated the RHNA for the SCAG region. And OCCOG is arguing that that number should really be more like 651,000 housing units and not 1.34 million housing units. And then I would just point out the significance of these changes are that in the last housing cycle, our number was 669 housing units, and we've gone up in this cycle to 2,415. And that number, like you mentioned, Ryder, we're not alone in this. Cities like Garden Grove, for example, have an allocation of nearly 20,000 new housing units. All of Orange County has over 180,000 new housing units that were assigned to us during this housing cycle. So we're not alone in the burden that is being responsible for us to carry.
So there's a natural question that comes like, did the city fight their allocation? I mean, you talked about the lawsuit in OCCOG, and I know we had some other questions about that, which we will get to hopefully here in a second. But my understanding is the city tried to make a pretty compelling case. In fact, I know they did because I've seen the content. Pretty compelling case for appealing their RHNA housing allocation, right?
Yeah, we certainly did make a pretty compelling argument. And I would encourage residents, Ryder, I think that those arguments are all on the city's website.
Correct, yes.
But I would encourage people to go and see the arguments that the city made. It fell on deaf ears. There were over 50 jurisdictions that filed appeals during this cycle within the Southern California region, and nearly every single one of them was denied.
Yeah, on the YLLocalcontrol.com website, under challenge to housing mandates, at the bottom, there's 3 options to review. And one of them is city's formal appeal to RHNA. And there's a bunch of documents, and there was a whole video the city produced. I mean, it was a real, effort to try to make that happen. So the city's done its part to get there. And where we're at right now, trying to deal with the best circumstance we can. And, I don't want to this isn't all dour. There's upside here and opportunities. There's opportunities to protect open space. There's opportunities to revitalize a part of the town that is not performing at the level that I think we would all want, and to create a new downtown experience. So there are many people in the community who are frustrated by the housing element process. And I think the general goal that we heard from the working group was, let's make the most out of this that we can. Let's try to make sure we protect, and let's try to make sure that we also revitalize some areas of town that would benefit from some revitalization. There are a couple of questions that have come in. I see Maggie asking some questions about the fact that RHNA housing seems to be based upon increasing population trends, yet we all know that the population in California is actually going down. So I guess how does that affect maybe this cycle or potential next cycle allocation? Could we actually see HCD require more housing if the population continues to decrease, even if we're being asked to build so much housing now? That's speculative. We don't know what the allocation is going to be, or HCD's methodology, right, Nate?
Right. A lot of the methodology is spelled out in state law, and this is a great question, and we actually share with the frustration in this question. These are arguments that we raised over and over again during our meetings at the SCAG level. The frustrating part here is that the state has granted HCD essentially discretion over deciding what the number is going to be. So they have the ability to, even if you can provide them, which we did with documentation demonstrating that their population projections are not correct, the state has shown that they get to trump whatever our local allocations at the SCAG level demonstrate. And that's been a really frustrating part of this process. When you've got the state legislature passing these laws, you've got the executive branch that's in control of how this is distributed, and then you've got it, as we're seeing from the OCCOG case, a judicial branch of the government that's not willing to step in as part of the checks and balances. It all just seems to be that the entire California government is just has an agenda to move forward with as much additional housing as possible. So to tie into the question of in the next cycle, unless things change, the state's still going to be in control of what those numbers look like and how they're distributed out to the regions, and then SCAG will determine how that's allocated out to the jurisdictions. But that's just why we're going to be monitoring it as closely as we can and being participants in the process. And I would encourage the residents, those that are participating here, I would encourage you to be involved in the process as well. When I want to point out one thing you'll see on the YL local control website, when you go and look at how we tried appealing and fighting the allocations that we were given, we had more participation from Yorba Linda residents than any other city throughout the SCAG region through that process. Unfortunately, it didn't help us out in the end with getting what we wanted, but there's something to be said about having people participate, and I would encourage you to participate in that process.
In some ways, the summary of what I'm hearing you say, Nate, is elections have consequences.
That's a very good summary.
All right. So one quick item that was asked, and there was a question about my comment about the ADUs. So hopefully I didn't create confusion with that. But how are the ADUs that were mentioned as the reason the RHNA housing numbers don't add up and distributed around the city? So where are those ADUs? How many are west? How many are central? I think they were just in a general pool, right?
Yeah, it's just a general pool. The state didn't require us to identify exactly where those units were going to be placed. But I would like to point out that the city of Yorba Linda, we were able to basically push against the state and get a much higher allocation of ADUs than any other jurisdiction throughout Southern California and even throughout the state that I'm aware of. I get cities that call me and ask me, how were you able to get the state to authorize as many ADUs for your jurisdiction as you did? And we did get a really high number. It wasn't as high as we were hoping that we would get from the state, but we feel pretty fortunate with the number that the state was willing to give to us.
Well, and some of that's, I assume, a result of having lots of big backyards, so it's more realistic in Yorba Linda than other communities.
Absolutely.
All right. David, I apologize for keeping you on the sideline for so long here. I promise I'll have a question for you. I just keep wanting to go back to my bro, Nate. I guess the last question for you, Nate, and then I got a few for David that I want to throw his way. But so there's a lot of conversation about trying to revitalize Savi Ranch and whatnot. So is there a search on for a quality developer or redevelopment organization to help create that integrated plan, or what's the vision down there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it's important to point out that, again, cities don't develop housing, and we typically don't develop projects. Even the town center. I mean, the city did not develop the town center. There was a developer that came in and developed that. So this development is really the role of the private market, and all the city really does is put the zoning in place. And that zoning establishes the rules for what type of development can happen on a piece of property. So I can say that within Savi Ranch, one of the major property owners out there is currently working with some various planning and development firms to look at options. they're especially looking at some long-range vision planning related to his property. And so, you know, that's happening separate and apart from the city. We kind of touch base from time to time on questions that he might have on the city process, but that's really being handled by this private property owner.
Okay. Nope. All right, David, I promised you a question. I got a question for you. So, what is the city doing about monitoring kind of housing mandate actions, legal actions around the state? Are we just sitting back, or are we paying attention?
Oh, no. As the community may know, we have a legal firm that represents the city, Rutan and Tucker, and they have pretty strong resources to monitor all new laws, not just housing laws, but they're particularly focused on housing laws because, kind of Nate mentioned, we just had this barrage of new housing legislation coming out almost constantly for the last few years. And candidly, it's hard to keep up on all the new laws, but our legal counsel is closely monitoring these and looking for opportunities to basically opine in a way that supports Yorba Linda's interests. And so as far as actual legal action that's taking place right now, there are cities that are grappling with housing element and housing policy related issues. Unfortunately, as has already been mentioned, legal counsel has been monitoring the status of these cases, and they don't seem to be resolving very often in favor of cities. Again, I think pointing to the very strong legislative agenda that is in place right now to solve the housing crisis and further housing production in the state of California.
Yeah, and then I would just, there's another follow-up question that's been asked around kind of the OCCOG suit and where that's at. And I know we had a question, so I'll just note that the OCCOG suit, if you go to the YL Local Control website and go to news, the second story down is about that city-supported lawsuit and kind of the status of the OCCOG. OCCOG stands for Orange County Council of Governments. Council of Governments are these sub-regional collaborative entities that are created to help regions collaborate. Sorry, that was a redundant statement. So effectively, it means all the cities in Orange County are part of the OCCOG, and those cities got together and jointly filed a lawsuit to try to put into question the actual sheer number of units that were allocated to SCAG, or the Southern California Association of Governments. And we're going to try very hard not to use too much jargon tonight, and I don't want to bury you all in details, but we also want to be transparent with you. So sometimes that means you have to join us in the details. David, what is the, I guess to that point, we talked a little bit about OCCOG. I actually kind of feel like we've talked OCCOG a lot. So fundamentally, OCCOG lawsuit, we joined that lawsuit. That lawsuit was attempting to question the methodology by which the 1.35 million units were allocated to the Southern California region. Right. At this point, that lawsuit has been was kind of dismissed by a lower court. Maybe that's not quite the right terminology. I'm sure it's proper in our article. And so now that's on appeal, or is being considered for appeal, because it went through a couple rounds, and now I think our next appeal is up to the California Supreme Court.
Yes, that's correct.
So we are pending, like as we just saw recently with another local government case, it took 3 years, I think, for the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, to render an opinion on it. So we could be looking at a couple years if the Supreme Court even chooses to take up the case in California at this point.
We should know within the next couple of months whether or not the Supreme Court of California will even take that case. Okay. So.
All right. So I guess we'll find more to be seen on the OCCOG lawsuit itself and what the actual outcome is going to be on that. And obviously we'll be tracking that closely and keeping the public in Yorba Linda informed about that particular lawsuit.
For sure.
Does our legal representative know if the builder's remedy law in California has actually been tested or adjudicated in courts? So this kind of goes back to that question. I think we had a conversation about this, about how we actually tested builder's remedy.
No, and I think Nate commented on that as well. I'm not aware of any cases that are directly on point that are testing builder's remedy. We did get some news that I believe it was the city of Beverly Hills, Nate, that came out today, in fact, that they are faced with a builder's remedy application, and the court weighed in and said that effectively that application is a legal application, and it must be administered by the city of Beverly Hills. As far as other cases that are directly on point, I am not aware of any that have been resolved yet. There are some that are in process, including the city of La Habra. But in many cases, these builder's remedy applications become a vehicle for negotiating approval of another, perhaps lesser or more palatable development project in communities. And we know that was the case in Santa Monica, where I believe there were probably upwards of 7 applications by one developer that were submitted, and were negotiated down to projects that were agreed upon by the city to process in order to avoid litigation. So it may be that the builder's remedy in many cases is really used more as a leverage tool. But it may be that some of these do wind up in the courts and ultimately are adjudicated. So
Yes.
we'll keep our eyes on that and kind of see what happens with those.
I think one challenge there is, as you guys know, these lawsuits can go on for quite a while, so we may not have an answer by November of 2024 too. But we'll see. So Diane asked a question here: is, are we worried that in some point maybe builder's remedy would or could supersede Yorba Linda's housing element? I guess my quick observation I would make is everything we've seen so far is if a developer perceives that the city has a certified or a conditionally certified housing element, they aren't coming knocking on the door or submitting a builder's remedy. That's why Yorba Linda, and moving earlier, managed to get their conditionally certified housing element, and that essentially gave you protection, right?
That's correct.
So hard to speculate about that getting replaced or superseded. To some extent, if they did that, it would be like, kind of ask the question, what's the point of having, I mean, I guess there's other reasons to having a housing element, to be clear, but it would take away one of the major risk factors around that, or one of the major benefits of having a certified housing element. And certainly the state seems to be interested in carrots and sticks. They just seem to have a lot of sticks right now. Irene asked a question: how does builder's remedy differ? And this, you're going to have to help me out here, gentlemen, on your expertise in housing. How does builder's remedy differ from the protections afforded to the developers from the California Housing Accountability Act? It seems that one is no worse than the other. So why worry about builder's remedy when developers will have a free hand once a site is rezoned? I guess I'm not particularly clear on why they would have a free hand once it's rezoned. So can you comment on that? Or
I'll try. So builder's remedy is actually a part of the Housing Accountability Act. It was a new provision that was added a handful of years ago, and it was not used until recently. It was kind of dormant. I don't think developers really knew about it. But as it started to be tested by the development community, it became a big deal. The Housing Accountability Act, as I understand, the main provisions of it are that if a developer comes to a city with a housing project, the city is compelled to approve that housing project so long as it is consistent with the zoning and the general plan land use designations of the site, unless the city makes very stringent findings that are related to health and safety related concerns if the project were approved. So in other words, you can only deny a housing project as a city if you make findings that to approve it would create a dangerous condition or other significant health and safety hazard.
David, if I can add on that as well, one of the other reasons why builder's remedy hadn't been used previously was because most jurisdictions during the 5th fifth cycle, and even during the can't remember if it was part of the fourth cycle, but they had certified housing elements. It wasn't
Right.
until this new cycle when cities were now under the gun to have a new housing element prepared that really opened up this opportunity for builders remedy. And you include within that the high requirement or allocation given to jurisdictions, and then
Yeah.
HCD has made it even harder to get a certified housing element. All of those competing interests have really paved the way for builders remedy to become
Like a perfect storm.
Mhm.
Yeah, there was a pretty significant portion of cities who didn't have any sort of certified housing element. I'm not quite sure what the ratio is at this point that doesn't have a certified housing element, but there are some that are still running without, is my recollection.
Yeah.
David, how did so here's another question that was posed. How did the resident working group come up with in this questioner's viewpoint, a better plan in 6 weeks versus the prior plan that the city had developed that took a much longer time? What's the difference?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that one of the key factors that really drove the initial process was we were working under a very short time frame and needed to get something in place quickly in order to meet the statutory time limits for having a housing element that was certified. And so because we knew that if you didn't have a certified housing element, all of these potential sanctions, it would open the door to those, including builder's remedy. And so we were working under a short time frame and did the best we could. We didn't do a great job of public outreach, not like we're doing now. We're doing direct mailers and a lot of other techniques that are going above and beyond in comparison to the last time around. We kind of did the minimum, to be honest. Again, it was in the interest of trying to meet a very short time frame. I believe it was October of 21, Nate. Is that the time that
Yep.
we were working under? Had to complete CEQA compliance. We prepared a program EIR. All these things are very, very time intensive. So we thought, that we were under the gun to really get something in place, and it became, clear as we went through the process that we needed to have more public input. But that competed again with this idea of wanting to have a certified housing element in order to insulate us from builder's remedy and some of these other sanctions. Some of the other factors that kind of played into the resident working group's success is I think it was a grassroots effort. And a lot of the folks that plugged into the housing element before, many of them were opponents. And they became sort of at this time advocates, I'll say, for this revised housing element with all the changes that we've been discussing, and taking into account all of the discussion about, what happens if we don't get this housing element certified with this next opportunity at the ballot in 24. Taking into account all of those factors, I think that they felt that, it was important to work cooperatively and to come to consensus. And they found a path to do that through those efforts. And I think that, we said it earlier, it wasn't that, everyone was really happy with the result, like what a great plan. It was more seen as, hey, let's come up with a plan that we think balances out the housing numbers, the RHNA number across the city's geography in a reasonable way under these guiding principles that intend to protect our single family neighborhoods to the greatest extent feasible. And I think that with these guiding principles in place, it really help them to move forward and come up with a plan that they could stand behind, and hopefully the rest of the community can stand behind as well, and get us to November with a positive vote.
Well, get us at least get us to the point of getting to a ballot measure where the residents can actually make that decision. But fundamentally, I think what we heard from the working group was, well, what I gleaned from that partly was they spent, many of them spent 20 hours, like 20 hours diving into this, talking to neighbors, coming to our six meetings with 2 hours at each meeting, plus sometimes 2.5 hours when they weren't kicking us out of the library. It was a lot of detail to get through, and a lot of I think helpful information that in its totality started to show a pathway forward. And getting to the principles was also super helpful for that process. So one other thing David, just to be, I guess also be responsive to, because there's a question I just saw here that's an interesting one, which is, we're here explaining what this plan is, but where is city council, right? I mean, is this fundamentally from my perspective, this is a resident driven plan. We put some residents in a room, we gave them some parameters, they came up with some ideas that represented compromise among them. It was started off the basis of a plan that was previously advanced by the city council based upon community feedback. And the plan today that's being discussed was touched upon during the plan review, or the working group kind of output report, and city council voted unanimously to give us directive to move forward with that as the baseline housing element to enter this community engagement phase. Is that I guess a fair description of the facts?
Yes, and that's the process that we're in now. The council was very appreciative of the work that the working group did, and on I think it was July 18th, that report was presented to the city council and community. And I think that the charge was, hey, roll this out to the broader community and let's get additional input and see if the community feels similarly to the working group on kind of the conceptual revisions to the housing plan. It doesn't mean that it's still not a work in progress, however. And I mean, that's the process that we're in right now, is gather more community input in order to see if there are additional changes that could be made to the plan to make it better and, get to the end game that we're hoping for.
Yeah. And I would just observe too, that I know fellow residents, not staff, not the council, fellow residents are going to be, who are on the working group, intend to be present and involved in those working group in each of the workshops we're going to have, to also hear directly from fellow residents and also have a chance to engage with them. So this is, much as the whole process I think we focused on here is grassroots opportunity for residents to help solve this problem, and for us to try to give them as much information as possible to understand the trade-offs and hopefully come to a conclusion that's going to work for the community, is I think the foundational goal and the directive that council and our working group have both been pursuing. All right, kind of change the subject here, but a lot of questions during this process in the working group, and certainly in some of the pre-questions, were focused on the term lower income housing. And my take on that is that can mean all sorts of different things in different contexts. Legally, it can mean different things. It has different perceptions of what that means. So for purposes in the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, in the table that's in our the report, which basically has the allocation of low, very low, moderate, and above market housing, what does low income mean in that perspective? And I guess share it with me by household terms, and what does that look like, David?
Right. So you described the four income levels that are sort of part of RHNA, and very low, low, moderate, and above moderate or market rate. And just as an example, we kind of combine low and very low as we speak about these various categories into just lower income. So using that category, the low and very low, the upper limit of that, and I'll back up just a second. So when we determine these income levels, they tee off of a baseline, which is the median income for the region, which is the County of Orange. And HUD just released the 2023 median income level for Orange County, and I believe it was about $128,000 for a family of four. And so that is your baseline. And then HUD also sort of defines affordable housing cost as not paying more than 30% of your gross annual income for housing. So when you take 30% of that figure, actually, I'll back up. For the low income, it is up to 80% of the median. So 80% of that 128,000 is roughly about an income of $115,000 per year. And then applying the 30% as the affordable housing cost factor, that equates to about $34,500 per year that is considered affordable housing or rent for a family of four in that income category. That equates to about a $2,875 a month rental rate, which is still, I would argue, a fairly high amount of money for monthly rent in our area. And I think that's because housing costs are just really high in California and in Orange County in particular.
Yeah. So, and notably, it's the upper band of that, right? But fundamentally, by RHNA housing allocation, lower income threshold starts at $115,000 for a household of four, and then drops off from there over right. Who would be included in that kind of classification of lower income. Second, I guess a follow-up question on that then was, are there any existing lower income developments in town now that are designed for people in lower income brackets? And can you discuss where they are?
Yes, I'll describe a few. These were constructed more recently during the 5th cycle. So there's a couple in Savi Ranch. Most residents have probably heard of the Oakcrest Terrace and the Oakcrest Heights projects. They're located down near the retail center in the back part of Savi Ranch. And then even more recently, we had a project that was constructed off of Lakeview Avenue, just north of the new public library. It's known as the Lakeview Senior Apartments. All three of those projects are 100% affordable projects. They range in targeted income levels from extremely low, like there's some veteran senior units in the Lakeview Senior Apartment Project that are for extremely low level. There are others that are in the low and very low, but I don't think there are any moderate in any of those three projects. On the above moderate side, because that's also a category that's included in RHNA, I would point out an example across the street from the Richard Nixon Library that was built maybe about 8 years ago by Brandywine Homes, the Covington, I think it's called the Covington Townhomes. That's a 10-unit per acre project, again, built by Brandywine Homes. So, yeah, there's a few examples.
And for purposes of zoning, when something gets zoned lower income to make available for lower income, my understanding is that basically means it's zoned for 20 units per acre or more. In other words, it has higher density. Is that correct?
Yes, they're called the default densities, and the 20 unit per acre minimum is one that requires it actually, in order for that to be a default density, you have to have a provision that mandates that at least 20% of the units are for affordable in that project. The other way to do it is to have a range where it can range from 20 to, I believe, 30 units per acre. And then it can be optional whether or not the affordable 20% affordable units are provided. In other words, because there's additional density available, it's seen by HCD as an incentive for builders to provide housing that is more affordable. Sort of again, this idea that as a higher density project, as you go up in density, the price is going to come down naturally just by market forces. And so that's considered the default density. And you have to zone property in that 20 to 30 unit per acre density range in order to get credit for your low and very low RHNA portion of your RHNA.
So but the flip side of that is you can there is stuff zoned in Irvine along Jamboree, at least my impression, that's zoned at 20 or 30 units per acre, and the units are renting for $4,000 and $5,000 a month. It might be high density, but it's certainly not low income.
True, and again, it's
market forces.
There are ways to kind of force a project to include affordable units, and it's called inclusionary housing. And usually it's in HCD's housing element world, it's required to be a minimum of 20%. But then there's that option where if you zone property at a higher density, then developers can sort of opt out and build, at market rate. So yes, and we found that with other housing cycles that, we zone property as required by HCD to meet these income categories, the default densities, but they ultimately developed market rate. In some cases, there were some units provided, like some of the units had covenants on them to meet lower income or moderate, whatever income level we're trying to target. And in some cases, developers contributed in lieu funds towards a housing fund that the city maintains for housing assistance. So there's different ways to kind of achieve what the state requires of us.
Sure. And then one other related question that sometimes gets smashed up with lower income housing, which is, and these are questions we heard come up and came up in tonight as well, which is Section 8 housing and how does that? And I think I saw one comment as well about, the city's just going to build Section 8 housing as part of this housing element. So could you just talk about what that is and what that really means, just for clarity and openness?
We don't have any Section 8 housing in the city. In fact, I don't know that Section 8 is really focused on Section 8 funded housing anymore. Section 8 is the most common aspect of Section 8 is it's a federal rental assistance program. They actually call it the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And it basically gives people a voucher that they can use to write down their rents, and they can use it wherever they want, essentially, as long as there's certain criteria that have to be met for the quality of the housing in order to meet the HUD requirements. But the idea is that it be portable and that people can move around and use their Section 8 voucher to help bring down the cost of their rent.
So theoretically, somebody could be using a Section 8 voucher to live in an apartment in Yorba Linda, but it wasn't because the apartment was built for necessarily Section 8. It was just there's a renter who's using a Section 8 voucher.
Yes, you can even use the vouchers to help purchase a home.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. And a few times tonight we've talked about kind of this going to the voters. So, which is going to the voters to get approval on zoning changes is not entirely unique to Yorba Linda. There are other cities that have these provisions, but can you just give the background for people who don't know about the Measure B and what that is?
Yeah, we throw around this Measure B term like everybody is aware of it, and that's not necessarily the case. We have new residents that haven't been here since its origins in 2005. It basically was a citizen initiative that came out of actually prior downtown redevelopment efforts that were failed, and a group of residents who were displeased with the results of some of the prior downtown redevelopment efforts put a ballot measure on the ballot to basically control growth. And what Measure B does is it requires any changes to the zoning or general plan land use designations in the city, changes that would increase the number of housing units that can be built within those areas, to be subject to voter approval before they can take effect. So if the city council wanted to approve a particular project and it increased the number of residential units on a property above what the current general plan and zoning is, that would be an item that would need to go to the voters. So we had in the fifth cycle housing element measures H and I, for example, and those were on the ballot because of the Measure B requirement that those zoning changes, be approved by voters.
Okay.
And that's what Measure Z was.
Okay.
Last year.
Right. Measure Z was a result of the previous Measure B. And
Right.
to be clear, so any zoning changes there's a number of zoning changes that will be subject to Measure B approval. Ultimately, the people listening in on this conversation tonight, all their fellow neighbors in Yorba Linda will have an opportunity, if you're a registered voter in the November 2024 election, if the city council chooses to move forward with zoning changes that would require a ballot measure vote, it will be on a ballot in November 2024, again, subject to city council direction. Most immediately, we are here focused on the housing element itself to get your feedback on it to ensure it's reflective of community feedback. Right. Susan had a whole series of questions about Savi Ranch that I would like to get to. So first question is all this new, so we're, as Nate noted, there's about 800 units going into the Savi Ranch area, creating some new density and kind of a new downtown experience. First question is, that's going to take a lot of infrastructure down there. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to make that investment in the infrastructure?
Well, all improvements, public improvements related to development are paid for by the developer. If you're coming in for permits to build something and your development causes the need to increase the infrastructure in the area to serve your project, then you basically sign up for making those infrastructure improvements yourself.
Okay. Nate, there was another question related to this from Susan was there's a significant number of low-income units. And again, these are low-income defined by density of the RHNA housing process, not necessarily that they will be low-income. But there are a number of low-income units located in the Savi Ranch at high density. Why are they not spread out throughout the rest of the city? And why did the city choose to do that?
So again, really, really good question here. What I want to point out here is that the resident working group, they really wrestled with this issue of fairness between the east side of the city and the west side of the city. The west side of the city has larger lots and they tend to be older properties in general, which tends to create more opportunities for redevelopment. The east side of the city, in contrast, they have a lot of the newer homes tend to be out that way. And you also deal with a lot of steep topography within that area. So that really limits development opportunity. Since there's a lot more opportunities for development on the west side, this leads to this fairness question that I mentioned from the residents that are on the west side. And especially because they felt, because a lot of the properties during the fifth cycle, the fourth and fifth cycle were located on the west side of the city. So the east side, and I don't mean to turn this into an east versus west, but this was part of the discussion that came up in the working group. The east side was very concerned about fire evacuation and the impacts that additional density would cause on the east side of the city during a fire. So the working group members, they felt, all the working group members felt that Savi Ranch was a great location to add additional housing units to make things more fair. And as one of the principles, we kind of talked about this at the working group, that was one of the principles that was important to them, that there was a bit of a fairness factor. So as proposed by the working group, and not necessarily by the city, but the working group proposed that the east and west sides of the city currently share about the same number of housing units. As you saw from that table, the numbers are about the same on the east side versus the west side. What you see is that the west side tends to have more sites that are at lower densities, whereas the east side has fewer sites, but there's higher densities there. And so that's how the working group had recommended things move forward from a fairness and spread it across the city perspective. That was their recommendation.
Okay. And a following question, what concerns does the city have or plans to mitigate development becoming kind of disconnected from the city, or a concentration on housing that is poorly aligned with the rest of Yorba Linda, or where it seems to have created a low-income housing zone in Yorba Linda?
Yeah, so that's a great concern and a valid question there. So each of these developments is going to have to likely go through what we call a design review process, where we review the proposal at the staff level to ensure that it complies with all of the local laws, and that there's a high level of design required, or a high expectation of design within the city of Yorba Linda. Those design reviews are then brought forward to the Planning Commission for their review and consideration. That's a public meeting where the public has an opportunity to weigh in on the design of those projects. I would like to also point out that there are several other existing lower income projects that we've talked about this evening. Oakcrest Heights and Oakcrest Terrace and Savi Ranch, the Altrudy 1 project located just north of the library on Lakeview. If you haven't had an opportunity to go and look at these sites, I would highly recommend going out there for a site visit. I think you'll find that they really are very professionally done. Some other examples of mixed income or market rate projects that were done during the 5th cycle would include like the Brandywine homes across across Yorba Linda Boulevard from the Nixon Library, the Malia homes and Lennar projects at Lakeview and Bastoncherry. So definitely worth checking those out. I think you'll see that the design elements that are incorporated there are of a high standard.
Nate, if I could just add that what I said earlier about how oftentimes the way that it plays out in the real world because of market forces is these projects have a mix of different income level units, including market rate. So we're not really warehousing just low income people in one particular area. We would encourage sort of more of a mix of different housing types and income levels, and avoid that sort of creation of a specific localized area where just one type of housing or one income level is created.
And if I can add to that, David, I think we find that market factors tend to make that happen anyway. It's really hard to fund a 100% affordable housing project. What you typically tend to see is it sprinkled throughout projects.
Yeah, it's very difficult otherwise.
So the other question that I've seen come up from several people tonight, and then some pre-submitted questions too, is traffic issues, right? There's already concerns and questions about egress and ingress into the Savi Ranch area. There's a single point of ingress and egress David, can you talk about those concerns, what the impact is of adding 800 units, what the city currently has slated for that intersection?
Sure, Ryder. It's a great question. And, traffic in Savi Ranch has kind of plagued the city and that area of the city from the beginning, because it's such a kind of circuitous circulation pattern there. And it's been looked at a couple of times, and there's been some adjustments, and it's been improved. But it still is rather cumbersome, and some of the just the geography and geometrics of the street and the layout and everything makes it difficult to improve circulation. However, as part of a 2015 effort to look at some additional ways to improve mobility in Savi Ranch, there were sort of short-term, mid-term, and long-range mobility solutions that were examined. And the long-range solutions were fairly, I'll call them pie in the sky. They included like a bridge across to La Palma. These are multi-million-dollar efforts that would need funding sources from a variety of different federal, state, local, and regional levels. And because it's such a local serving area, the city wouldn't compete really well to attract funds for like a bridge over to La Palma. So setting sort of that aside for a moment, the city is focused on the short-term and mid-term improvements down there. There was a design that was put together to widen Savi Ranch Parkway, where it intersects Yorba Linda Boulevard, Weir Canyon, and also add a lane to the bridge, the Weir Canyon Bridge, in order to introduce new lanes, a bike lane, and turning lanes at that intersection. And that is going to improve the circulation and improve what we call the level of service of the intersection, which is just a term to describe how well an intersection functions. The choke point in Savi Ranch is that intersection. So those improvements are on the city's Tier 1 capital improvement program now. And the design is, if it's not complete, it's nearly complete. And we're looking for funding sources. Our public works folks are working on that. And, if you have more specific questions about that project, I would invite you to speak with our public works folks. We probably could even put a frequently asked question up on the website and kind of dive into the details of that a bit more. But prior to moving forward with sort of assigning or recommending 800 units in Savi Ranch, we needed to kind of figure out what the capacity, the traffic capacity is in Savi Ranch. And so we did do an analysis. We had LSA, their traffic engineering firm, do a traffic impact analysis. And they looked at the existing development and the trip generations associated with the different uses out there, and introduced the idea of, or the trip generation associated with certain amounts of housing, and also took into account as an already completed project, these traffic roadway improvements that I just mentioned. And what they found is that there is residual, or will be residual, capacity in Savi Ranch for about 850 additional housing units, while still meeting what the city's general plan requires as an acceptable level of service. Level of service is, again, a traffic engineering term that gauges traffic congestion at intersections, and it's rated on a scale from A to F, A being the best and F being terrible. and the city's minimum standard is level of service D. And with the 800 units, 850 maximum units, and I should point out, and assuming that all of the retail square footage in Savi Ranch remained and was operating at a typical level in terms of its traffic impacts, it still concluded that traffic would operate at level of service D after all the improvements are in. And again, it assumed that all of that retail square footage was fully operational, like a typical retail center. We all know, though, that that area is struggling now and likely is going to be replaced by other uses, including the housing that's contemplated there, and other uses. So I think it was a very conservative analysis, and we're going to do more traffic analysis, of course, when we get into the next housing element 2.0 that we've been talking about. There will be additional studies that will be required to be done that dive into that at an even deeper level.
Okay. I think you just answered a bunch of questions I saw around the development and its impact. I mean, I guess here's one question. Do you foresee that any of that development may trigger the need to get to a additional ingress and egress point? And if so, like, does that fall on the developer to develop?
No, the analysis was predicated on the improvements that are currently proposed. It didn't contemplate the bridge solution, or there was one other solution that was looked at back in 2015, which was kind of a frontage road solution that paralleled the freeway. It didn't rely on those solutions as assumptions for the analysis. It only looked at the roadway widening and additional lanes, turning lanes at the intersection of Savi Ranch Parkway and Weir Canyon that are currently a capital improvement project. Okay.
There was a question here posed by Rudy about, basically it said, do any of the council members have an interest? I'm assuming it's financial interest in getting developments done within the city of Yorba Linda. So the quick personal, I don't know personally any of the council members. I mean, I know them professionally through having spoken at council meetings and some conversations I've had with them, but fundamentally, I don't know them personally. The quick answer and the simple one that's a universal truth is there are very strict ethics codes in ethic laws in California that are monitored and managed by the Fair Political Practices Committee for the state at the state level. And if a council member has a financial conflict of interest or a family member, I can't remember if it extends to children, but it certainly extends to a significant other, a spouse, they have to disclose all that. Having been a former planning commissioner myself, you have to fill out what's called a Form 700, and it has to disclose all your financial interests, your real estate holdings, anything that would be kind of at risk or indicate that you might have an interest in some vote that you take. And if that exists, you have to recuse yourself or not be a participant in the process. 4 of the current 5 council members on city council were involved throughout the housing element process last cycle around. And none of them recused themselves. And they all seem like they know exactly what they're doing when it comes to the ethics rules. And I have confidence that they would have recused themselves if they had any identified conflict. But all that's public information. And Rudy, you can check out those Form 700s and anybody else can at the city's, at the state's FPPC website. So there's a very strong indicator. There's no conflict of interest there, of course. And then there was a question asked here about what steps are being taken to assure that the meetings that are held, this was a pre-question we got, are that the meetings that are being held are neutral settings, safe for attending, and that the city staff provide accurate information to educate the public through the process, and that the city officials are reminded that they serve all the public. So I will speak to the meetings. This one, I asked if I could answer this question because I've been avoiding answering most of the questions tonight, but this one is a little bit near and dear to my heart as a communications nerd. So fundamentally, the city's engaged in one of the most robust community engagement programs I've seen in my work with over 150 cities in California. I was deeply impressed by the residents who gave up so many hours of their time to work through the working group and actively engage in this process. And that working group recommendation derived and arrived at by your fellow residents did not have one single change to it from the council when it was sent on to move to the public for further feedback and participation. So there's been a consistent theme from the city council of seeking a resident-driven solution to the housing element conundrum in the city of Yorba Linda. And they've then backed that up with resources, including these workshops that we're going to be conducting. I'll just foreshadow all those workshops are happening outside council chambers. They're in public spaces away from City Hall. I'll be facilitating those conversations and meetings. They're lined up to be 2 hours long. The focus of those meetings is going to be a bridge version of our presentation tonight to make sure everybody in the room is level set on facts and information. And then we are quickly going to shift to Q&A, and then we're going to shift to conversations at your tables where you will sit with your fellow residents and noodle through the issues and the challenges and look at the maps and talk about issues. And then we're going to be encouraging every table to report out their conversations, what they see, what they like, what they don't like. But everybody gets a chance to have a voice and share that. We also are going to be, and I'll be doing my level best to make sure that's a collaborative environment. It doesn't have to be agreeable. We're allowed to disagree. That's a good civics experiment. Many of the people in our working group didn't agree, but fundamentally, they worked out the differences and never tried to get to a proposed solution. And my hope is we will carry that same spirit into the community conversations that we're going to be facilitating in the coming weeks in Yorba Linda. So that's I guess, the general commitment. The final point I'll just make is we're 100% dedicated to accurate information. This is a very dynamic environment with some of the lawsuits that are going on. But all the maps we're providing, all the data sets, the formulas, the best answers we can provide you on legal risks and challenges, the trade-offs between higher density and lower density and where that's all going, that's an open book. If you have concerns about that, I would encourage you to talk to the working group members who are involved. I feel like we gave them very straightforward answers and try to answer their questions. And fundamentally, this is all going to come to you, the voters, to vote on. You need to feel confident you have good information, and we're doing our level best right now to make sure you're getting as much good information as possible, so that you can make an informed decision when it comes down to it. There's another question that just came in that's relevant to this, which is, will the people on this call and other sessions receive emailed information for the upcoming workshops? So the quick answer is yes. First of all, you got a mailer hand-mailed to you, or not hand-mailed, but through U.S. Postal Service. Number two, there is an email list. And I believe if you go on the YLLocalcontrol.com website and you go to contact, you can actually submit an email there and request to be signed up for the email list, and we'll add you to the email distribution list. You can also email YL Housing Element at yorbalindaca.gov, and we will also add you to a mailing list. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell yourself, tell your spouse. We would love to have as many people as possible on our email list and make sure it's getting through your spam filter to keep you 100% informed. If we have 300 people at our workshops, that would be incredible. It might be overwhelming, but it will be incredible. We certainly want as much public participation as possible. And so we'd encourage it. And keeping people informed about those is front and center for us. All the workshops are currently outlined on the YLLocalcontrol.com website as well. So if you just go to YLLocalcontrol.com and submit there, you'll get every possible scenario for the workshops, the coffees, and other events that we're hosting. You'll also find this very video tonight that we're recording as well over on that. Nate, a very esoteric and nuanced, a very deep dive question, and we're going to use a term here that's kind of nerdy in the planning world. Will the city be performing a new program environmental impact report and taking action on areas of concern, particularly traffic and safety? First of all, would you please explain what a program environmental impact report is, and then answer the rest of that question?
You bet. So the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which is commonly referred to, requires that any discretionary application that's reviewed by the city, that essentially an application that goes before the city council or the planning commission, has to have that project that's evaluated for its environmental impacts. An environmental impact report is the most intense level of environmental review that outlines a lot of different environmental factors. The difference between a program EIR and a project level EIR is essentially that a project level EIR, you know exactly what's going on with the project. There's a specific development that's being proposed, and you can evaluate the specific impacts related to that specific project. A program level EIR, which is really what this is that the city is looking at modifying zoning, and the program level EIR analyzes, if you were to take the worst case scenario that each of those sites that are being proposed for potential development, what would that look like from a traffic standpoint, from an evacuation standpoint, from a variety of other environmental impacts? And it evaluates it based on a worst case scenario from a hypothetical scenario. And many projects, after it's been through a program level EIR, when a specific project comes in, it's analyzed further to determine whether or not that specific project is in compliance with the program level assumptions, or whether further environmental analysis needs to be done on that particular project. So that's my brief description of that. But so the city will be going through additional environmental analysis related to this new housing element study. And it'll include updated traffic studies, as well as additional analysis related to, definitely related to emergency evacuation. Many of the other factors may not really be impacted, environmental studies that need to be analyzed, but that'll be a public document that'll be available for review as we get closer through the process. So probably looking at the time frame of next year sometime before that's ever prepared.
All right. Thank you for asking that very deep dive question. Nate, I have a follow-on question for you as well. So in a prior meeting and conversation, I'm guessing this, I don't know if this came from a working group meeting person or it was just somebody watching a prior council meeting. But we were told that Yorba Linda was allocated units from the Inland Empire. What is the fold increase in units in Riverside in the last cycle versus this cycle? Is it also 4 times? And I think fundamentally this goes back to, in some ways this speaks, I think, to the, well, actually it doesn't speak to the OCCOG lawsuit. That's a different issue. This goes into the some inside politics around SCAG and how SCAG allocated units. So at the risk of going down a very deep dive, and I would encourage this person to ask this question and come to one of the workshops, what's the gist of how that played out?
Yeah, so again, this first part of this question is correct, that we were allocated units that were originally assigned to the Inland Empire. And this was very frustrating. This, as you mentioned, Ryder, this was a political maneuver, essentially that was initiated by the city of Los Angeles and the city of Riverside at the last minute, after 2 years of consensus planning among other SCAG working group members. What resulted was that Orange County and Los Angeles County cities essentially took all of the projected and existing housing need, or at least a large portion of it that was intended for the Inland Empire, and it was shifted into the coastal areas. And the thought behind it was that essentially the jobs and the transit are primarily within the region are primarily located in Orange County and Los Angeles County, and therefore, in order to help reduce congestion on the 91 and from other places from the Inland Empire, more growth should happen within Orange County and Los Angeles County. So in the 5th cycle, the Inland Empire, Riverside areas, they were responsible for about 42% of the total RHNA. So they felt during the 6th cycle like they'd taken their fair share of the development, and that's partly why they pushed back on this. So in the 6th cycle, Inland Empire, Riverside, that whole area, they're responsible for less than 10% of the total RHNA this time around. Orange County and Los Angeles County cities are taking the majority of that 1.34 million housing units. And it's unfortunate, and we fought that to the best of our abilities that we can, but it is what it is at this point. we've exhausted all efforts to fight that any further.
Okay. And then, so I guess a corollary question, Susan asked this, Susan raised a question that essentially is focused on why is the city expending efforts to resist the state's mandates? And, you know, I think one thing I want to observe is we've been answering a lot of questions that were submitted to us. And if they have sometimes come off as having a negative tone, we're just attempting our best to answer the questions that were posed to us. And there's some very strong community sentiment around resisting state housing mandates in general. And we're attempting to be responsive, both from council direction and from community feedback on those questions. But to Susan's point, we should, you know, address this. Why is the city expending so much efforts to resist the state's mandates? David, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really not that the city doesn't feel like it has a fair share obligation among other cities in the region. And, you know, we all know we're in a housing crisis, and that building housing is good for the economy. And there's a lot of reasons why housing is good. But what I think is concerning to residents is the way that the state is going about it. And the city wants to incorporate housing in a way that respects the Yorba Linda community. And it seems as though the state legislature is looking at housing provision throughout the state through a single lens, a lens that maybe is more reflective of, you know, an urban sort of built environment or model. And, you know, Yorba Linda is a bedroom community. It was always kind of envisioned to be, you know, more single family. And, you know, these mandates and this one size fits all approach from Sacramento is off-putting to many residents in Yorba Linda and throughout, you know, many other communities. There's just a lot of concern about loss of local control. And I think that, you know, the efforts to try to affect some changes to these laws are reflective of that concern. So I think the city certainly is willing to comply with the law, but, you know, like the OCCOG lawsuit, for instance, is claiming that the regional RHNA didn't follow the law, and their, you know, the 1.34 million units was an overreach and extensive. So I think that you know, is again off-putting, and the city, you know, if the city's being asked to follow the law, it feels like the state should also follow the law.
And I think my interpretation is partly goes back to a slide you had about do both, right? I think the city council is interested in doing their jobs as council members to have serve the public and have control of the destiny of Yorba Linda. And that can either be best be served by battling legally and other politically for local control retention, or achieving a compliant housing element that does its best to preserve the local control of the city to, within the state mandates, achieve its vision for what the future is of Yorba Linda. Is kind of how I interpret that too.
Yeah.
So we are at 8:03. This 2 hours went very quickly. Could I impose upon you gentlemen just to answer maybe 10 minutes more worth of questions? We're still not going to get through everything, but there's a few low-hanging fruit ones here that might be fast to answer.
You bet.
Okay. Yeah. First question I see is Yorba Linda right to vote specifically states that it trumps all other laws with respect to rezoning. Why does it not protect Yorba Linda from builder's remedy? My quick perception on that, and first of all, let me just say I'm not an attorney. My perception on that is it's a local ordinance and it can't trump state law. That's my impression.
I could try to take a stab at that.
Sure.
The Measure B, the way that it's structured, there has to be zone changes that are considered major amendments in order to trigger the vote provision. And since the builder's remedy is a law that really obviates the whole concept of current zoning and general plan land use designations and doesn't sort of require changes to those regulatory mechanisms in order to effectuate housing, it doesn't trigger the vote provisions of Measure B. And so, you know, if that were to come forward, I'm sure there would be arguments, you know, to the contrary. But honestly, the way that Measure B is structured, you have to have changes to the general plan land use and zoning in order to trigger the vote provision. And builder's remedy doesn't require that.
So we're both going to put a giant asterisk on that answer and ask our legal counsel to also follow up, and we'll add it as a frequently asked question to the website.
Sounds like a plan.
But I think you got two related and supportive interpretations of what the potential outcome is there. Aaron asks, if voters certify the resident recommended changes to the housing element, what is the timing on those zoning changes taking effect, Nate? I think you talked about this a little bit before.
Can you read me that question one more time?
Sorry. If the voters certify, like say they vote yes on where the changes are.
Oh, okay.
How quickly will the zoning become in effect?
So the zoning would go into effect when the election is certified by the registrar of voters. And so that zoning would be put in place at that point in time.
Which is roughly December of 2024.
Right.
Okay. So then it would take effect, and then developers would start theoretically either acquiring land with the zoning to develop stuff, or there's an existing person who already owns the land wants to develop, and they will start developing plans, and then it will go through the normal city process for anybody who wants to develop anything in the city of Yorba Linda.
And I think what's key there is that if they want to, they could, and they may not want to. And I'll just throw out an example. I would be surprised if all of the congregational lands that are in there immediately want to move forward with something. Some may, but many likely will not.
Okay. And here's another question. So there were a lot of questions that came up about why Yorba Linda, community feedback about why Yorba Linda was so fast to move on getting a housing element done. I guess, one silver lining, regardless of the Measure Z failing last year, you at least had a conditionally certified housing element for the last chunk of time that's given you protections from builder's remedy and some of the other negative consequences. But the question I see here is what happened to the 3-year extension that was given to other cities to implement their housing element? Why can't Yorba Linda take advantage of this 3-year extension?
This is a really good question, and I'm glad that this one came up. So that time extension was only granted to jurisdictions that had a certified housing element. And Yorba Linda was only among about a dozen or so jurisdictions that were granted that time extension. And it's because we met that original deadline of October 1st, 2021 with having a certified housing element. Every other jurisdiction that didn't have a certified housing element by that point in time does not get to take advantage of that time extension. So they're all subject to builder's remedy until they get a certified housing element. Whereas Yorba Linda, because we took that initial effort to try and get certified on time with the original deadline, we're not subject to builder's remedy. The other challenge with builder's remedy and getting a certified housing element after the deadline is that HCD will not approve your housing element. They will not certify your housing element until you put the zoning in place that is outlined within your housing element. So jurisdictions, it's going to take them years to get the zoning put in place that didn't have a certified housing element. And in the interim time, they're subject to builder's remedy. We, on the other hand, because of the efforts that we put in, we are not subject to builder's remedy. And that's why it's so critical that that voters seriously consider adoption of a housing element in November of 2024, because that is the end of the 3-year time extension that was granted to us. That's why we're so desperately moving forward with a plan that voters can get behind and support, because local control is so much better than state control.
Okay. And then we're gonna cap her tonight, since we're talking all about Measure B. I'll ask this one as our last one, and we'll try to wrap up here. So Irene asked a question, which is that Program 14 of the city's housing element calls for the city to take several actions to mitigate and or remove Measure B as a constraint to housing development. These actions include a Measure B ballot initiative by 2025 that would provide city council discretion about rezoning without further ballot initiatives. So I guess, can you speak about why that document's in the housing element, or why that line is in the housing element?
Yeah, that's in there because HCD required that we put it in there. It was something that they required in the 4th cycle several years ago. And in the 5th cycle, for whatever reason, they didn't require it. When we submitted our housing element in the 5th cycle, it wasn't included. We took it out and they didn't catch it. But in the 6th cycle, they asked us to put it back in. So we put it back in. But if you look at the wording of it, it says that the city will consider, or the city council will consider options for kind of overcoming the effect of Measure B, yeah, I mean, it's the regulatory effect of Measure B. We've already done that in our housing element. We have looked at ways of eliminating barriers to housing provision through means that do not require Measure B, such as through the passing of an ADU ordinance. We put fees for ADUs, plan check and permitting fees, passed a moratorium on those fees in order to incentivize ADU construction. Nate, help me here on some of the other things that we've done. We've looked at housing or housing opportunities that don't require any rezoning. And included those in our housing element, just relying on already existing zoning. In fact, that was a big part of, I think, what the working group's recommendations were, as one of the strategies for reducing the number of housing sites on the west side is, instead of upzoning property, let's reduce the density on many of the sites on the west side. And then also not upzone those sites at all in some cases. I think the Yorba Linda Garden site off of just north of the Yorba Linda Highland Reservoir is an example of that. We're just asking for credit for existing zoning there. So any other thoughts, Nate, on some of the ways that we would argue to HCD that we've already met that Program 14 requirement?
I think you've hit on a bunch of them, David, but the one thing I would add to that is that any modification to Measure B requires a vote of the people. And so while there are no plans to move that forward, I just want to assure the public that if there were any sort of attempt to modify Measure B, that would have to be brought forward in front of voters.
Amendments to a citizen passed initiative can only be approved by the citizens.
Thank you for that.
And just kind of anecdotally, I think that the council has absolutely zero appetite to amend Measure B. It's something that they respect. They've been on record for years being very supportive of the public's right to vote.
Yeah, I think to the best of my knowledge, staff has not been directed to address Measure B at this point, or to take on and even consider it. So that probably gives you a good sense of where the city council's heads are at on that. Okay, I'm going to end with that question because I've already taken 15 extra minutes I didn't plan. There's like 7 or 8 questions we didn't quite get to. My apologies, we didn't get to all those. But I'm shocked we were able to get through as many as we did tonight. There were some many excellent questions tonight. So I think I think the many of you who stuck it out for the long phone call, this is going to make a heck of a recording. And I encourage those who are watching this later to put it on 2X and get through it as fast and reasonably possible as you can. But some great answers tonight. If you could bring back up the PowerPoint deck, I'd appreciate it. So real quick, this conversation continues, right? Tonight was primarily about answering questions, getting a level set on folks to get some information. Hopefully we'll get a lot of viewership on this video ahead of the workshops for people to participate. We have 3 in-person workshops coming up, one in each kind of area of the city, central, west, and east. You can see the respective dates on the screen right now. All those details are at yllocalcontrol.com. We encourage you to ask us questions as you did tonight through the email address ylhousing@yorbalindaca.gov. We're also going to be doing a coffee and housing policy chat over at Monarch 9 Cafe on the patio. That'll be on October 7th from 9 to 10:30 in the morning. And then ultimately, when we've gone through the workshops and we have a plan that has benefited from public feedback, in late October, it will be heading towards the Planning Commission for consideration. And Nate, the timing on that is to go to Planning Commission or David, and then from there it would theoretically go to City Council?
Yes. We want to do a check-in. It's not required by HCD to send an amended housing element up to them for their review, a draft amended housing element. But we do want to put that in front of the City Council as well for their blessing before we do that. So after Planning Commission, it'll travel to the City Council.
Okay. So that'll be yet another opportunity for additional feedback and public comment at that Planning Commission meeting. We urge engagement early and often on this subject with us, asking questions and giving us a chance to get you answers that you deserve to get answers to. We hope that you found the questions in the Q&A tonight valuable as part of that process. And again, please, you will find this video on the YL Local Control website. We hope you will share it with your neighbors and friends to get some questions answered for them as well. And with that, I want to thank Nate, David, the back-end technical crew that helped us out tonight, and also the Yorba Linda City Council for supporting this outreach effort to get answers for the community and make sure you're fully informed about housing policy issues. With that, I look forward to meeting all of you at one of the upcoming events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.